In today's world, faith isn't about easy answers. Faith is about asking hard questions, following your curiosity, making a difference. At the Candler Foundry, we believe in a world in which you can consider new perspectives, find your purpose, reimagine what's possible. When we come together to learn, grow, explore, belong.
Welcome to Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring opportunities for rich theological learning beyond the walls of the seminary, making them accessible and engaging for everyone. In that spirit, this webinar series features discussions of newly published academic works and invites the broader public into the important conversations that these books engage. My name is Elizabeth Arnold, also known as EB, and I'm the Scholar in Residence and New Testament teacher for the Candler Foundry. I have the pleasure of being your Foundry host and conversation moderator this evening. We are discussing the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition of the Bible. With us are several of the translators who worked on this edition, and they'll share with us the work they've done and the insights they've gained. While all our panelists are academic scholars, this conversation is not just a collection of formal academic responses. Hopefully, what you'll hear is more like being in a living room with a few folks talking about an interesting project and an important experience they shared. At any point, you, the audience, can put through questions or comments using the chat feature. Our team will collect and curate them, and I'll pose those questions to the panel as they relate to our conversation. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce you to Susan Hylen. She is Almar H. Shatford Professor of New Testament here at Emory, and also the Director of the Women Theology and Ministry Program at Candler. Joining with her is John Kutzko. John is Executive Director of the ATLA, and that's the American Theological Library Association for those of you who don't use it all the time. And he also serves as the Director for the NRSVue update. Jennifer Knust is also Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University. And quite possibly, we will also be joined by one other surprise guest, should he be here. Stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for being here and welcome. Thank you for working on this version of the Bible.
Thanks for
having me. It was a privilege. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think one thing that would help us all get started is if we understand what prompted this revision, what prompted this update, and how is an update to an edition different than a whole new translation? And I imagine, John, since you kind of helped head up this project, would you mind sort of starting off the explanation for us?
Yeah, thanks. First, it's a pleasure to be here and also to see the two of you again, Susan and Jennifer. So it's really not a small thing that what we set out to do echoes the 1611 King James Version. In the preface, it says, and I quote, "We never thought from the beginning that we would need it to make a new translation, but to make a good one better." And so the preface that SBL provided to that front matter of the NRSVue emphasized that we weren't starting from scratch. Our purpose was to conduct a review, a 30-year review, evaluating the accuracy of the NRSV translation based on new textual evidence and scholarship while trying to maintain the translation's tradition. And a lot changed since 1989 when the NRSV came out, especially in areas of textual witnesses, what texts that were available, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, scholars are always looking at the meaning of ancient words, what we would call philology, and a lot of insights came in the last 30 years. And so we try to bring those to bear. The conversations began with the NCC back probably 2013, maybe even earlier than that. And they were they were hearing from publishers that the publishers felt that the translation needed to be updated. And so before we even put any pen to paper, we worked with the NCC to figure out what that mandate was, and how we would go about the process and when we would try to deliver it to them.
Okay, so how did Jennifer and Susan, what areas did you all work on?
Well, I was one of the general editors for the New Testament. So with my colleague, Mike Holmes, we had the great privilege of surveying the landscape of incredible scholars of the New Testament and looking for experts on the different books and then inviting them to contribute their editorial suggestions around the mandate, to look at the text again and see what textual advances had been made since the 80s, and also to review the philological questions and translation questions in light of the changes over the last 30 years. And Mike and I worked together to identify scholars and then invite them to the process. And then we worked with a team, including John, and to review those suggestions and to bring the entire project into a kind of whole, so in the New Testament side. So that was my role.
So a very synthetic, joining all the parts together.
Exactly. That was my job, or I tried anyway.
And I was one of the people that Jennifer and Mike invited to be a book editor for part of the New Testament. And I was the book editor for the pastoral epistles. So 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And that meant that I reviewed the NRSVue translation and considered all of the possible options that might be available for how we might better translate it in light of recent scholarship, and then made some, not very many, right? Very abstemiously made suggestions about what might make the translation better. And then it was out of my hands, right? So I didn't really know a lot about what would happen until I really got the final project, but it was exciting to work on.
Susan, what did you find like either challenging or really interesting as you were working on 1 Timothy?
Well, just in terms of the translation project itself, I think being a book editor was really interesting work to do, but it was also sort of disorienting because I didn't know what any of the other book editors were doing with their words, right? So a lot of the same issues arise, and you'll have the same question about translation in one book and then another book. And so it seemed to me like, well, if I were talking to the 1 Corinthians person, then I would, ask them these questions about what they think. But I wasn't talking to them. I didn't even know who they were. So that part was an interesting challenge, just to think about, how all of those pieces are related to each other. I think the other part of the process that to me was really challenging was to try to figure out how many suggestions to make, I guess. The phrase as what is it? As literal as possible, as free as necessary, is what we talk about in terms of trying to translate it. But that means different things to different people, right? So I was trying to decide what was too literal. Where did we need freedom in translation in order to render it into sensible English, right? But to still be as true as possible to the Greek. There were definitely places where the NRSV was just strange. The translation just didn't totally make sense if you were looking at the Greek. So there were some places where it was really easy to decide how to smooth things out. And then there were other places where it was sort of a quandary. And it was an interesting challenge.
To piggyback on that too, one of the challenge of my job was that once we got the ball rolling and had the materials that we would use as guidelines, I really tried to fly at the 35,000 foot level to help stay within the mandate and apply that mandate, focusing on text and philology as consistently across the books. Of course, we had about 70 moving parts people. And so we really didn't want it to render something uneven in an update and cause really distrust of the final product. And so all these editors, book editors working in many ways silos, the general editors and the staff were creating all kinds of tracking texts to be sure that we rendered something consistently. Mm-hmm. And Susan touches on one thing that's important. We did focus on any changes to the text that we knew, Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts, and philology. We tried not to. While we did improve the style, we kept on using the word parsimoniously. That was our buzzword. And so we asked the book editors to improve the style, but only when the English was awkward, unclear, inaccurate. And some of the NRSV language really was all three of those things. But the challenge was some of the book editors really went to town. They wanted to completely turn that into a 2022 translation. And that was a challenge because then we'd have an uneven update.
I keep thinking, oh, go ahead, please, Jennifer.
Well, I was just going to say that one thing I felt happy that we were able to accomplish, thanks to the work of the amazing book editors, is we did actually make things a lot more consistent. I'm not sure when the original NRSV committee worked together, if they just got exhausted and they just couldn't manage it anymore. But Bob Bueller was particularly excellent at this point, where we would just always check to make sure, for example, Adelphoi or Brothers was translated quite inconsistently across the New Revised Standard Version, and in the New Revised Standard Updated Edition, it's quite consistent. So if the word is Adelphoi or brothers, it's translated brothers and sisters, unless it's clear that only men are intended. Whereas in the Newer Revised Standard Version, for example, you'll see believers, or all kinds of different options. So now if you see brothers and sisters, you know what Greek is behind it. So that was actually something really important to us as general editors, is to sort of help the translation achieve a level of consistency so that the Greek was better reflected in the English. And that was parsimonious, I think, and also consistent.
I keep thinking about the story of the Septuagint's translation, where they had like 70 translators and they all just miraculously came up with the same thing. This sounds like you had just as big of a project, but there was so much more going into, obviously, the story of how this gets translated. So I think this is really helpful for so many of our viewers that are with us to be able to see how much actually goes into bringing us the Bibles that we read in our pews. Is there and to see that this was highly communal, like even when you are, like you said, Susan, didn't know who the other translators were, when it comes back together, even though you were all reading and translating these separate documents, there is a sense of the whole when it comes back together. Was there any like major disagreements, or like any area where it was just really, really challenging to be able to bring those things into that kind of harmony that you're talking about?
I can speak to one. I'm curious to know what John and Susan will say too. I think one that was really challenging for us was what to do with doulos, the word slave. I think that there were a number of book editors, as well as members of the general board, that would really want to be consistent and translate that word as slave, slaves, or enslaved person, enslaved people very consistently. And there was some pushback about that from the National Council of Churches, and John might want to speak to that. And so we had to come to a different decision around how to treat the word doulos when it was applied to a person. For example, when Paul says, I, Paul, doulos of Christ, the general editors, following the recommendations of many of the book editors, had suggested Paul, slave of Christ, but now if you check, it's back, it remains servant, Paul, servant of Christ. And I remember when that decision was made. For me, it was hard because I'm part of a particular school of scholarship that feels very strongly around that, translating that as slave. And I had to reconcile myself to the idea this is a translation by committee and I don't get to decide this. And there's a good rationale for servant. And even if it's not my personal taste, it's not really about my personal taste. It's about what we as a group decided together very thoughtfully and carefully. And that is okay. And in fact, the way to go.
Yeah, that we had a number of words. We tracked a number of words that were really challenging because we were trying to be historically accurate, but also sensitive to how the text can be misused. And we know the text can be misused. And so we tracked these words and we worked with different groups. Another word was Iudaioi, the Jews, or Iudaioi. And it was really an exhaustive list that we tried to systematically work through. And Paul's slave of Christ was a challenge. Eved in Hebrew wasn't as much of a challenge. It's mainly the human institution. But in the New Testament, you get into this divine human relationship. And slave of Christ for many in the African American community struck them offensively. So this was one of these challenging words that we had focus groups. I think we had 4 focus groups around the country. And in the end, while Jennifer's right, again, we can talk about how as a Catholic, I find relying simply on a translation is problematic as opposed to commentaries and notes and things. But in the end, we decided that Solomonically is that if it was the human institution, we translated as slave. If it was the divine human relationship, we translated servant. That may be imperfect. We tried to make the notes speak about that so that you knew what lay behind the expression, but that was the kind of the compromise.
I think even that is a great improvement because there were so many places in the NRSV where you might think this person was a servant of their master and maybe they were, getting paid and, happy servants, but in fact that is entirely unlikely in the first century.
And Jennifer spoke to we did find even after 30 years, the NRSV had a lot of inconsistencies, even remaining typos. And so of the 20,000 changes, a lot of those were casing and consistencies. The nomenclature for festivals and things like that are now very consistent. And we did at like Adelphois and Slave of Christ, you can see the consistency now that wasn't there.
We have someone who just put a question into the chat, and Andy says, given the goal to be as literal as possible, as free as necessary, how did you balance maintaining that readability for modern audiences while preserving the historical nuances? Was there a set of guidelines that you give translators or any particular, I don't want to say rules, but sort of directives in order for that? I know that you all brought them together afterwards, but how did you prepare them for this?
There were a set of instructions that were sent out. I'm not sure how effective they were, Susan, but I know that they were sent out when the invitations went out. And so there were some suggestions, and then sometimes book editors were in conversation with the general editors as well during the process. Not every book editor was in conversation, but there was a sort of a handbook that was sent out with the invitation.
Yeah, that's right. There definitely was. And I remember the word parsimonious, parsimonious rather, but being part of that. I think the person asking the question, like, you're exactly right. Like, that's the question that you have to ask. Like, how do you balance that? But in even if you say it as well as you did in the question, it's just difficult in practice to decide. Especially when you're starting with an existing translation that people, read as their Pew Bible, right? And so you're not seeking to sort of throw it out and just change it willy-nilly. And it's really a pretty good translation to start with. So, fairly literal translation when it's possible to be literal, right? The problem with being too literal is that it stops making sense in English. It just, it's not the way that we express ourselves. So, I will say there are some historical improvements, right, that scholars have made, better understanding the social history of the New Testament, thinking about what particular words and phrases mean. And so there were places where it was fairly easy for me to, rethink what a word might mean based on recent scholarship. Overall, it's a really tricky and interesting question to engage with.
Andy, it really is an interesting question because the NRSV really is the great grandchild of the King James Version, and the King James Version has a certain ring to it that people can identify. They know it. It's like Shakespeare, and it's and through that process, from the King James Version to the Authorized Version to the RSV to the NRSV to the updated edition, there's a certain liturgical quality to it. It isn't the most stylistically modern translation, but in part we were trying to maintain that liturgical value. There were cases, and I wish I could think of them right now, and I should probably find them, where a better scholarly rendering would have erased a very traditional expression. And we avoided making those changes.
That's interesting. While we were talking about how do you maintain this readability, right, with these sort of historical things, did you test it out? Like, because it's readability is one of those things that you can't know until people are actually reading it. Did you have groups that you sort of tested it out on as you were producing these translations, and what were their responses if you did?
The NCC did. So when we submitted the final, or what our final version to the National Council of Churches, which owns the rights to the RSV and the NRSV and licenses to publishers to print, they then compiled maybe a dozen focus groups, reader groups around the country. And they came back to us with recommendations for changes, some of which we accepted. We thought they were fair enough. Others we pushed back and said, no, we really need to stick to this one. But it was a very fruitful conversation. There was no challenge to it. They just wanted to hear our reflection on what these focus groups submitted. But that said, to Andy's point, and I think to Susan's, the NRSV isn't the living Bible. It's not this fluid readable Bible. But the more you get to that fluid readable text, the more you lose something of the cadence of the literal translation. And we knew that we couldn't, in the time we had, start from scratch with kind of almost the software technology that you could have to maintain a certain reading level. And the reading level of the NRSV still remains close to the 10th to 12th grade level, whereas most Bibles really shoot for 9th grade level. So it does shoot a little high. But had we allowed for the English style, heavily changing the English style and the rendering, it would have been hard to maintain consistency across the whole translation.
I think we also tried to remember that this is the updated edition, right? This is not a new translation from scratch. And so as John was mentioning, sometimes book editors were like, okay, I really need to I want this to be a lot better. And they would change like blocks of text, right? Susan didn't do this, but some people did. And then we would say, no, I mean, we can't do that. So we would try to take if there was something the book editor was offering that was really an improvement philologically speaking, or in terms of smoothness that didn't really completely transform the New Revised Standard Version into something else entirely. We tried to keep that and respect the book editor's recommendation, but this is not a new translation. This is an updated translation.
And that said, we were really, so some of these changes that Jennifer refers to were really good changes. Mm-hmm. And some are what a next iteration might want to adopt. But what we were really cognizant of the fact, because we didn't get this from the previous 1989 translation, what we left for the next generation is a veritable library of our detailed conversations, the minutes from the meetings in detail, the recordings of all the conversations. And so the NCC and future reviewers, translators have access to the kind of really deep, intense conversations we had in these monthly meetings.
Go ahead.
I will say I was recently teaching in my introduction class. I was teaching Galatians, and I was really excited to see that the updated edition decided to go with the faith of Christ instead of faith in Christ as the translation. Now, scholars will know exactly what this means, but for amateurs, this has been pretty much a long-standing shift in scholarship to accept the idea that this phrase pistis Christou in Paul's letters is better translated faith of Christ, which maybe speaks to the faithfulness of Christ, right? The obedience of Christ unto death, those kinds of ideas, right? And so upholding that idea as opposed to the faith in Christ, which is about our own individual commitment to Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Not that that's not important to Paul, but to understand what Paul is talking about, I think it really helps to be able to use that contrast and to actually have my students be able to see it there in the Bible was a really great experience. It's now it's flipped. So if you look at the footnotes, it says faith in Christ, but before that was the other way around. And so I had to convince them that no, really, this was a legitimate scholarly translation and they should think about it. And now it just seems to make my job a lot easier.
That is a great example because Jennifer will know that we're being asked to appear before a body to defend that change.
I bet.
Yeah. And I think that meeting is coming up soon, so we'll have to prepare for that. But yeah, I mean, these kind of changes, I mean, it's the Bible is very personal. So you make any kind of change and you've riled someone, scholar or public. But a change like that, people really hone in on. Give you another example. We changed the expression sin offering to, what was it?
That purification.
Purification. And I had, so a reviewer came out and said, accused us of taking sin out of the Bible. Now, I can really assure you there's plenty of sin left in the Bible. We weren't trying to take it out. Folks will look for a change like that and think there's an agenda behind it. Mm-hmm. And we, I can say this with real soberness. We did not apply any kind of liberal or political lens to the text. We were really approaching it as text critics, philologists, historians, social historians. But because the Bible is such a proxy for all kinds of social debates, folks look for a change like faith in versus faith of.
Yeah. But on the other hand, Susan's absolutely right. I mean, there's been a tremendous change in 30 years on that question about faith of Christ versus faith in Christ. And there's pretty much scholarly consensus that faith of Christ is the better translation in that context. And so when the book editor recommended that change and then we did all kinds of research to make sure that there was really a consensus. I mean, we discussed that at length and we're convinced that yes, this really is the scholarly consensus. There's good reasons for it. And it is the better translation. But of course, the faith in Christ is in the note as well. So we'll see what happens at that meeting, John. But I'm going to review my notes too. But we had a long list of reasons why we went with that. That was a very difficult and thoughtful decision.
So think about that.
For how controversial translating the Bible is, right? In that same conversation, some of my students were talking about their devotion to the King James Version as their favorite translation of the Bible. And we were talking about the differences and why it's not an updated scholarly translation and so forth. But what I should have said to them was, remember that when the KJV came out, it was extremely controversial, right? Yes. There was yes. People died, right? It was so controversial. And fortunately people aren't dying today, but it continues to be controversial. It makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, I would often get questions, how many changes are you making? And we didn't try to estimate or guesstimate in the beginning when we took this project on. And we were really clear with the NCC that the review itself was valuable. If we made no change, that said something, right? And so when you try to calculate the impact of the changes, it's not about how many words are changed, but in this case, it's 2 letters that were changed, right? Mm-hmm. And that becomes controversial, and that becomes important because it is a theological decision.
Mm. And that I think is also a really interesting question. Is you're bringing together this notion of we're scholars, and so it's our job to make sure we're accurately representing what we see here in the text and updating that. But you've also said we also acknowledge that this is the church's book, and that we don't want to change it to the point where it's not usable or helpful for the church. Did any of you find like a theological or a spiritual challenge in taking on the project, or how did that impact you theologically or spiritually by undertaking this task?
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. Maybe Jennifer and John don't either. But I think to me that it's theologically interesting to engage in questions about the Bible and translation. But it's partly, I think I've grown used to the idea that it doesn't need to stay the same as it always is, and that the English isn't, is a couple steps removed from the the Greek New Testament as well. So those changes are interesting to me, but they don't make as much difference in terms of my own personal engagement with reading the Bible.
I guess I would say that for me, it reinforced some theological conclusions I had already reached, right? That through my work as a New Testament scholar, as a textual critic, as a social historian. And it reinforced how much translation and also even just reading and preserving texts is a communal effort. And that it's and we bring our context to these decisions that we're making about what the text is, what the book contains, how to interpret it, and then how to translate it, because of course translation is an interpretation. We're being as literal as possible, but there's not a one-to-one correspondence between first century Greek and English in 2020. That's just, forget it, right? So we have to work really carefully together and to use our best effort and intelligence and wisdom and reflection and conversation and care to take this legacy that we have been given and to be as true to it as we possibly can in our context now. One thing we haven't really addressed yet is the small changes, but yet significant changes that have happened to the actual Greek text underneath the translation in 30 years. And they may not seem like a lot, but actually there have been some significant changes, even in the New Testament, in terms of how textual critics understand the underlying Greek. And sometimes we made some pretty significant changes. Like I was just reviewing for this meeting some of them, and one of my favorite ones is in Luke. Actually, we moved the thing about hiding your lamp under a bushel basket into the text. And it was in a footnote before. So now it has it in the text, and the footnote says some manuscript, I get it right. Let me get it right. Other ancient authorities lack under the bushel basket. So, for me growing up in the church, that's great because I knew it, this little light of mine, I knew the bushel basket verse, but actually the New Revised Standard Version, based on the textual criticism that was the conclusions that were reached at that time, put that in a footnote, right? And it has to do with changing understandings of what the initial text of the New Testament likely was. So again, it didn't really change my theological convictions. It more supported my sense that this is a group effort, and that's a good thing.
I have to say, similar to that, again, from my own background, it reinforced how difficult it is to create a text that is sola scriptura doesn't work for me. You can't render a text that can manage all the nuances and the alternative meanings, and I like that conclusion because it reinforces that we need community. As Jennifer said, we need other resources. We need pastors. We need biblical scholars. We need educators. The second thing that was kind of a spiritual experience, I suppose, is I really believe that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And there were occasions in running a learned society of scholars that it didn't always feel that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. But for 2+ years, the monthly meetings were deeply focused, professional, serious, good-natured, spirited, collegial. And frankly, I have never experienced that type of thoughtful, respectful, focused, intense teamwork in a project that took so long, that could have worn people out, frayed nerves, and was so consequential, right? Because it's sensitive. You change anything, and it riles the public or fellow scholars. So it was a humbling process. It was a humbling process that gave me hope that compromise is possible. I think about that a lot these days when folks with a range of ideas have a hard time working together, even talking. And I wish I could have bottled that. And if I did, I would just give it away for free.
Oh, I love that. I think maybe you guys could stage like a demonstration, like a fishbowl, like for the rest of us, and show us how you did it. So on that note, you mentioned the faith of Christ was really throwing some people for a loop. Have you received any other feedback on this updated edition, and how have you dealt with that? Like, I imagine you can't go to every church that's had an issue with something that you chose to include or not include in your translation. So what's your means of processing the feedback that you do get?
Well, I've certainly received some emails personally around the decision to translate Arsena Kotoi as oh gosh, now this was actually Susan's brilliant idea, although we all affirmed it 100%. So we don't blame Susan, we thank her.
Men who engage in
exactly right, men who engage in illicit sex. And then the footnote says meaning of Greek uncertain. And Susan recommended that change, and the entire board, and then also the National Council of Churches, remember, we're going through several layers of discussion to get there, affirmed that because this is a word that is coined and appears for the first time in 1 Corinthians 6:9, and then again in 1 Timothy 1:10, right? And its meaning is uncertain. Like that is true. The meaning is uncertain. And the word sodomite, I think, which was the NRSV choice, is completely an anachronism and totally misleading in all the ways. A sodomite is a resident of Sodom, It is, this word has no meaning in this context. But I have received personally emails from people frustrated with that decision, who have assumed, I don't know why, I'm the woman, I don't know, but that I was somehow responsible for that personally. And I was like, no, I was not. And I've referred them to, this was a decision of a large group of scholars and pastors and professionals. And this is an appropriate translation. And here's why. And I wrote a piece for Bible Odyssey that tried to explain it a little bit more in case people had questions. But for me personally, that's the pushback I've received. I don't know about others, but I've definitely gotten some emails about that.
Yeah, for sure. That has been the focus. I've taken that kind of personally, and I try not to do that, but I did feel that my primary job was to maintain the integrity and trust, and not to allow a chink in the armor for anyone to accuse us of having an agenda. And we didn't. We were trying to be honest with that text. And in fact, it's one of the things that we're going to answer to this board. But in fact, if you look at the iterations, we were actually reverting back to the RSV in this case, where the NRSV added sodomy, and we were reverting back to because it was clear that there was a cultural context of the NRSV, and it carries a modern meaning that the text doesn't intend to carry. So there were many cases where we did actually revert back to the RSV. Instead of moving even further away. And that was one of them. So it wasn't really a radical change, and we were doing that with all care. We knew that a change like that, anything involving sexual politics, was going to be deeply discussed. And it has been, lots of reviews on it. But the sad thing, the hard thing for me is that it allows someone to think there's a chink in the armor when we were trying to approach this as carefully and thoughtfully as we could.
I think that's a really good point, John. And I'm so glad you mentioned it, because there were cases where the NRSV, for whatever reason, introduced, frankly, cultural context from the 1980s into that translation that did not fit at all with the cultural context of the first century. And this is an example of that. And there are others, I'm sure, that I'll look them up before our next meeting and to remind myself, where in fact, this is a more conservative translation in the old-fashioned sense of conservative, meaning don't change something that's working. Why would you do that? Than what the NRSV was doing. And there were other examples of that.
There was a joke going around by the end that oftentimes you'll see in the footnotes alternative readings, and sometimes you'll see meaning of Hebrew or meaning of Greek is uncertain. We wished we could have basically put that under nearly every verse.
Yeah.
Ditto. And because it still is an uncertain text in many cases, and that's in some ways part of the attraction of it, that we do approach it with interpretation. No one reads the Bible literally.
It was one of the strangest parts of the experience of translating it. Was in every other context when we're translating as scholars, we can footnote everything, right? You can put a footnote by every word of your translation and describe it, but not for the Bible itself. You actually have to just decide, and then very rarely footnote something. It's really hard.
Maybe you guys could release like an edition where you have all the footnotes included, and people can buy the extended edition, updated edition, and it's like 5-6 volumes or whatever, if anyone's so inclined to read that much.
It might be easier to just learn Greek and Hebrew.
And for our viewers, I've also dropped a link to Jennifer's article that she wrote there for Bible Odyssey, so you can check that out yourself. And of course, all of our scholars here have written lots of things that you can look them up and see other things that projects they've worked on, books they've written, and talks that they've given. Any final questions from our audience? Please be sure to put them in as we're wrapping up now. I guess my final question is, what, and I realize this is kind of a basic question, what was your favorite part? Like your favorite thing that you read and that you were just like, oh, this is great. If this was the only part, this was the part.
Do you mean in terms of the actual text, or you mean the part of the work? Because my initial reaction was just to want to talk about what a privilege it was to work with such an amazing group of people. And I really feel that way. I'm so honored that I got to be part of this process, and I learned so much from the book editors and from being in conversation with the other editors, and that those monthly meetings. I value those. And not only because we compromised and we could speak respectfully to one another and understand the value of and the dignity of every different perspective that was brought to the table. But also it was like a discipline, an ascetic discipline of meeting and thinking really deeply about these questions and being challenged by the points that the book editors made. And I would just love them, and I would have to make these judgments. But at least since we split the labor, where Mike and I were we would take turns introducing different ones, and so we would be the one that would have to send the first draft, and it was just such an incredible process. The process was what I loved the most. I mean, sure, they're text too. I could probably. I made a bunch of.
I know.
I really love the process.
I left that question ambiguous on purpose, so that's fine.
I think.
Go
ahead. So I think maybe an interesting thing for the audience would be that the changes that in some ways to me seemed the biggest changes, other than Arsena Coite, are things that people really won't notice at all. I mean, it really was, I think, a sense of just trying to be as attentive as possible to the syntax and grammar and vocabulary, and to make the translation better in whatever way that we could. But the couple of things that come to mind. One, what Jennifer mentioned earlier about places where the Greek had changed in the pastoral epistles. The Greek text, has been improved. So there's a sense that it actually says something different. But one of those cases in my books was, it was Jesus Christ instead of Christ Jesus, right? So it's not a big change. Doesn't change the meaning even slightly, and it's probably not anything that anybody's going to notice, right? And there were other things like that where, I felt really good about the work that we did to make it better, but in the end, I don't think anybody will be noticing, let alone complaining about those things.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was going to add is that there are times it felt that making sure we had Oxford commas was as important as making another decision, because we were serious about everything. Yes, I thank you. But the attention to detail and treating everything so seriously really was affirming for me, and for this discipline of biblical studies, which is really just a remarkable discipline where you're a social historian, you're a text critic, you're an archaeologist, you're a philologist, and I think it's unappreciated, the type of depth and breadth that is brought to a single text, that just reaffirmed the role that biblical scholars should be playing beyond just translation in society.
We have one final question that was just sent in, and of course this is one of our Candler alum, Chloe Granberry. She says, I teach teenagers in a church. As biblical scholars, what advice would you give young people that might help them read and interpret their Bibles well? And I think it's wonderful, because here you are, a whole generation of scholars, and we've got more coming up behind us. So what would we tell her as she's doing this work with her youth?
All right, I have one. Oh, Susan,
Okay,
but you should go first. No, I want you.
Well, you know how when you do the children's sermon and the answer is always Jesus, right? We kind of read the Bible like that too, right? We sort of think we know what it says before we read it. And so I think as much as possible to try to, make it strange, right? Don't think that you know what it's going to say before you read it, and find ways to try to pay attention. Just to notice what the story's saying as it unfolds, what draws your attention, right? Pay attention to those kinds of things. And just to even, honestly, with young people, certainly, but with all of us, just to cultivate habits of paying attention in this day and age is a really important thing.
So mine is related. I often find when I'm teaching Bible studies with young people, and I actually do this with adults too, I begin by asking, what do they wish the text said? And I ask that because I think if we know that helps us be open to what the text says, right? If we can admit that we have desires that we're bringing to the text, as we should, right? Because we want the text to say certain things. And sometimes it doesn't seem to say that, and we need to notice that too. So I often begin that way, and that provides a certain space, because I'm with John. I don't think that we can read the Bible literally. So if that's true, the Bible just doesn't simply speak to us. Let's admit that we want it to say something because we have things that we value. And usually in the young people that I work with, those values are amazing. Like, I want the text to recommend kindness. I want compassion. I want justice, these kinds of things. Great. And then when the text seems to betray it, then you can, those values, we can talk about that. And is it? And what does that suggest if there's a violation of our values in the text, we should notice that and not try to force the text to sort of into a box that's going to make it be one thing.
So I think I'm going to continue that line. I was asked to talk about the translation at a church in Nashville, and the pastor said, so all my notes are in my old NRSV, like, should I buy a new one? Why? Like, I don't want to start from scratch. And I said, but I want you to start from scratch. And so I encourage the alum to tell the teenager to stay open and to read the text slowly, because this curious pastor is now going to be looking for these changes. And I'm glad, because he's going to have to read more slowly, and he's going to have to give up all the notes he had and just start from scratch. But that kind of openness, I think there's a verse about this in the Bible, but it's the little kids that can stay open, and it's often we that become kind of encrusted. And so I hope she can keep that openness.
Well, my Hebrew Bible professor in seminary always said translation always occurs in the present. Mm-hmm. And so thank you so much for bringing this updated edition into the present by doing all of this good work. And just like the Bible was written, thank you for doing it together in community, and then for coming here and sharing it with our audience and answering their questions. We are so very grateful.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you all.